Okay, all right. You ready to go? All right. Hello, everyone. All of you here in person, all of you online streaming, and all of you listening on our radio partner KKFI. Welcome to the Forum at All Souls. Coming to you from All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm Joe Robertson, a member of this church and a member of the Forum Committee, which is in support of this forum, which for 80 years has been engaging our community in the most compelling and challenging issues of the day. Today we have Joni Wickham, founding partner of Wickham and James consulting firm, where she is teamed up with former Kansas City Mayor Sly James, for whom Joni served as the chief of staff. After several years in the political trenches of Jefferson City and North Carolina. She is also the author of the book, The Thin Line Between Cupcake and Bitch, which is not only the title of her book, but the title of her presentation for us here today. So let's go. Joni, welcome to the forum.
Thanks, Joe, and happy Sunday, everybody. What a lovely day for us all to be here together. Thank you so much for having me. Anytime Joe Robertson calls me to do anything, I'm, of course, going to say yes to it, but particularly when it involves coming to speak to all of you today. Again, thank you for having me. I am going to talk to you today about some of the concepts that I wrote about in my book, The Thin Line Between Cupcake and Bitch. And the purpose of me writing this book was really to talk to readers, both men and women, about how everyone can work together to widen that thin line. And I talk a bit, there we go. I talk a bit in the book about my personal journey because, as I'm sure is the case with many of you, my personal journey completely impacted my professional journey. So, the slide in front of you today, as you'll see, was a trailer. You can't really tell, but it's in the middle of what used to be a tobacco field. And this is in Franklin County, North Carolina. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's about, hour and 20 minutes northeast of Raleigh Durham International Airport. And this is the house, sometimes on wheels, that I grew up in. And this is where my grandma still lives today. We lost my grandpa about a year ago, but my grandma still lives there. And this window right here, that window is my bedroom. So that's my room when I go and stay with my grandma. That is the room that I stay in, and it's the one that I grew up in, learned to read in, played with my Barbies in, and that sort of thing. And so when I was in the mayor's office, as Joe mentioned, I don't think a lot of people would have assumed that the mayor's chief of staff came from us. And so it was really important to me when I wrote this book to tell the whole story and not just the story that started when I got to City Hall. So, my mother got pregnant with me when she was 14 years old. She had me when she was 15 and brought me home from the hospital to this trailer right here, which, as I mentioned, still stands today in the middle of a tobacco field. I was actually telling Joe that my 10-year-old, my daughter and I are flying out on Friday. We're going to go hang out with my grandma for a few days. And when she brought me back to this trailer, she was a young person herself, basically a kid, 15 years old. My grandma and grandpa never learned to read and write. To this day, my grandma is functionally illiterate. And my mom, as a 15-year-old new mother, knew she was wise beyond her years. She knew that the way to create a better life for me than what she had had was to make sure that I got an education, something that had not been afforded to my grandparents and something that she had not really been able to access either. And so my mom never dropped out of high school. She graduated. I have a picture of she and I at her high school graduation and a picture of she and I at my high school graduation. And in 8 years, I'll have a picture, hopefully, of she and I and my daughter at my daughter's high school graduation. She knew that education was going to be a life changing adventure for me. So she herself stayed in school, finished high school. She also worked 2 jobs in addition to that so that she could send me to the best early childhood development center, in our little community. So what that meant was that she wasn't around very much. It's not that she was out, partying and having a great time. She was going to high school and working 2 jobs. And so I was pretty much raised by my grandparents. And when you're a little kid growing up in this trailer in rural North Carolina, and you're pretty much raised by your illiterate grandparents, life looks a whole lot different than it does for my 10-year-old that I'm raising here in Kansas City, Missouri. And there were no Girl Scouts, there were no flag football teams, there were no Kansas City Young Audience camps, nothing like that because we couldn't afford it. And even if we had been able to afford it, there were lots of barriers for a kid like me. So I spent a lot of my time with my grandparents reading to them because even though they couldn't read or write, they really cared what was going on in their community and they couldn't access that type of information themselves. Which might be why I've always loved reading and I learned to read at an early age because I kind of felt like I had to. So I read a lot of news articles to them. We would watch the news together. Back then, some of you may remember there were like 3 or 4 channels, not 132 like there are now. And so the news and politics and public institutions kind of consumed my life because another issue with how I was raised, where I was raised, when I was raised, was that I kind of had to be that buffer in between my grandparents and public institutions and government. I had to help them navigate Medicaid. I had to help them navigate the public health system. I had to help them navigate how to get a driver's license because they couldn't read and write. And the practical application of being functionally illiterate also creates confidence issues. If you can't read and write, you don't feel very confident going into the DMV. You don't feel very confident going to the doctor's office by yourself because you can't understand the words that they're using. So I had a lot of experience with public institutions, politics, government, and the impact that politicians had on people's life just by the very virtue of how I grew up right there. So, uh, long story short, and I give more detail in my book, but we don't have 6 hours together today. I went to a teeny tiny all women's college in Raleigh, North Carolina called Meredith College. And I kind of thought I wanted to be a political journalist, probably because I had spent so much of my adolescence reading the news to my grandparents who couldn't read it themselves, watching the news with them because we only had 3 channels. There was no Netflix then, and helping them understand the world around them, helping them understand why they couldn't access Medicaid because they made too much money at $17,500 a year. And so I went to my advisor when I was at Meredith College and I said, I really want to be a political journalist. And she said, okay, we need to get you an internship because this was right about the time when those practical experiences were becoming really important in higher education institutions. So I was able to get a internship in the newspaper, my teeny tiny hometown, population 800 people in this town. So it was a weekly newspaper that covered 3 different counties. Ironically, considering what I did the last chapter of my life, my first assignment as an intern at this teeny tiny paper was to go to a city council meeting and report on their finance committee. So I am so excited. 19-year-old Joni, so excited. Walking in here, I got my reporter's notepad. That sound familiar? And this was before iPads. And so I go to this finance committee meeting, and there are 7 older white gentlemen sitting at this round table because in that time and place, that is what power looked like. I have nothing against older gentlemen. I've married a couple of myself, so this is not a speech about man hating or anything like that. But that is what power looked like uh, at that point in time. And so I listened to these older white gentlemen talk about a very big issue that they had. They had an $800,000 budget gap that they had to fill. And for a tiny little rural um, town, that was a huge budget gap. And so they had a real problem. So this finance committee, it just drawn on and on and on. I was bored to tears for most of it until one of the older white gentlemen at the table said, I think I know what to do in order to close this budget gap. And he said, let's just cancel out this WISE program. And the other gentlemen in the room kind of, you could tell, they kind of appreciated his sentiment and they were like, oh my gosh, someone has solved this big problem. And so they started talking about this WISE program and the fact that if they canceled out the WISE program, it would really help their financial picture. And the more they talked about it, my ears kind of perked up and I thought, this is not what they think it is. It was WIC, Women, Infant, Children. It was WIC. It wasn't WISE. And I knew exactly what impact that was going to have in the community, even though they didn't, because my mom and I had used WIC. WIC is a program that put food on my plate, shelter over my head, clothes on my back. It helped me take snacks to this early childhood development center that my mom worked so hard to send me to. So none of the older white gentlemen, middle class older white gentlemen at that table of power knew what they were doing, but I sure did. So I went back to my editor and I told him all this, and he was like, yeah, that's kind of crazy, but your role in the system as a journalist is to write about the decisions. So you're on deadline, go write about this. And there was something about that role that just didn't sit well with me. The fact that my role in the system was to write about decisions, good or bad, after they had already been made. So I went back to my editor and I told her, I was like, I don't know that this is exactly what I want to be doing. She said, well, that's the role of a journalist. So if that's not what you want to do, if you don't want to write about decisions after they're made, you need to think about working in politics and having a seat at the decision making table. I thought, that's cool. I like telling my little brother what to do. Maybe this is for me. And so we pivoted a little bit, and she helped me get a internship with then U.S. Senator John Edwards. Do you guys remember him? $400 haircut, major character flaws. I'll leave it at that. Major character flaws. But he was charming. And so I worked for him for about 3 weeks. And I got a phone call from my chief of staff in Senator Edwards' office. And she said, there is a big piece of tobacco regulation legislation that's going to be on the Senate floor this afternoon. Remember, Eastern North Carolina. I grew up in that trailer in a tobacco field. It's still there. You can still kind of smell the tobacco, I swear, when you go there. And this was a big deal for Senator Edwards and for his constituents. And as is the case in the US Senate, there were like 30 other hot potato issues happening at the same time. So there was no one on our staff available to write his speech except me. I was 20. But I had grown up in the middle of a tobacco field. Everyone in my family had something to do with the tobacco industry. And so at least I felt like I knew a little bit about the subject. So I wrote the speech, turned it in, almost cried because I just felt like I am totally out of my league here. What am I doing here? And within about an hour, I got a phone call from the senator scheduler. The senator wanted to see me. Oh my gosh. I seriously thought I was going to cry or something. I really thought it was so terrible and he was going to fire me because how could I, a 20-year-old from a trailer, how could I bring value to that type of environment? And so I go in his office. I sit in the on the couch. He comes and sits beside me, looks right at me, like all the good politicians do. They make you feel like you're the only person that they want to talk to in that moment. And he said, Joni, you are probably always going to be underestimated in your career because, his words, you are a petite, cute woman with a Southern accent. And he said, so you're probably always going to be underestimated. And you can either figure out a way to use that to your advantage, or you can be bitter about it for the rest of your life because this is the best speech any staff person has ever written me. And you didn't anticipate that. My chief of staff didn't anticipate that, but you knocked it out of the park. So don't underestimate yourself because if you underestimate yourself, you're giving permission to everyone else to do it too. And in spite of all his character flaws, and good lordy, there were plenty of them, that really, really stuck with me. And so I thought, well, maybe this environment is where I belong. So I went to the University of Missouri Columbia for graduate school. So I got to Missouri and I got my master's degree in political science, women's and gender studies, and ended up getting a job right out of graduate school at the state capitol in Jefferson City for then Secretary of State Robin Carnahan. You guys remember Robin? I think she came to this. I think she came here a couple of times. So I was working in the Capitol for her when she was Secretary of State, and early voting was a huge priority for her. And ironically, this tells you something. When Matt Blunt, her predecessor as Secretary of State, was in that position, he also championed early voting, and the Democrats hated it because Matt Blunt wanted it. So Robin becomes Secretary of State. She starts championing early voting, and the Republicans hate it because she wants it. Politics. So she told me that she really wanted to create some movement in early voting and sent me off to the Capitol for legislative session to figure out how to build a coalition of state representatives and state senators to get this done. So I had worked for probably a month trying to gather input, figure out the different ways I could bring these stakeholders together, and create a bipartisan coalition to get it done. It became very evident to me that I was kind of spinning my wheels, and the person that I really needed to have on my side was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So I scheduled a meeting with him and of course, he's 20 minutes late, like all the elected officials are. And I'm sitting there on his couch, waiting for him and looking at all the pretty pictures of him, his wife, and his two daughters. And he finally walks in. He walks in and he kind of like looks me up and down. And I'm sure the women in the room, you kind of know what this means when you're in a business setting and a guy walks in and looks you up and down. I'm like, okay, this is going to be an interesting meeting. And I said, "Hi, Mr. Speaker. I'm Joni. I represent Secretary of State Robin Carnahan. I'm here to talk to you about early voting." And he says to me, "I know what you're here to talk about, but if we're going to have this conversation, you're going to have to come sit in my lap." And so I'm thinking, maybe I don't belong in this environment if this is what I'm going to have to deal with. So I went back to some of my colleagues, and perhaps even more than what the Speaker of the House had said to me, I was struck by their reaction because about half of my colleagues thought I should have slapped him, called him a dirty word, and walked out. The other half of my colleagues were like, "Oh my gosh, there's no way with that type of interaction you're ever going to be able to get the secretary's agenda done." I can't, and I was absolutely flabbergasted because half the people that I had told this interaction to thought I had been too bitchy to him because I just told him I wasn't gonna participate in that type of activity and walked out of the room. And the other half of my colleagues really thought I had been too nice. So it was this dynamic of where do I land in this tightrope in this environment? And do I even belong here? So fast forward a couple of years, and Robin ran for U.S. Senate against Roy Blunt. And as I'm sure you know, she didn't win. At the same time, this guy named Sly James was running for mayor of Kansas City, Missouri. And I'm sure you know he did win. And politics is not a huge network of people. There are a lot of the same people in the environment together. And as it happens, some of the political consultants who had been working for Robin were also working for Sly. And I got to know them. And I got a phone call in April of 2011 from one of the political consultants. And he said, "The new mayor of Kansas City needs someone on his team who understands state government, federal government, because as it happens in local government, you're really impacted a lot by what happens in state government and federal government. And so the new mayor needed someone on his team who understood state government, federal government, and communications. And so voila, he thought maybe I was that girl. So I came to Kansas City and I had lunch with Sly. And I wasn't all that jiggy with the idea of staying in politics. I mean, that story I told you is one of like 100. Oh, that could be a whole nother book. I had kind of tired of the whole environment. And again, not really feeling like I belonged in it. And within 10 minutes of having lunch with Sly, I thought, oh, well, this could be different. This could be fun. And I really appreciated his visionary leadership style and just how authentic he was. So I came to Kansas City in May of 2011, and I was his director of public affairs for 2 years before I took over as his chief of staff. And what a wild ride that was. Part of my responsibility as chief of staff was to lead the negotiations on major development projects. You may have heard about this little airport terminal that opened this year. So I have gray hair, wrinkles, and high blood pressure. Streetcar was another big thing we did. We did an $800 million geo bond. The downtown convention hotel, which is now the Lowe's Hotel, big projects that we had to work on. And so when I was about 7 months pregnant, we really started in earnest negotiating the now Lowe's Convention Hotel. And I had to lead this big negotiation. It was one of the final negotiations that we had before it was set in stone. And there were probably 10 people, plus myself, in this negotiation. I was probably the only person under 60 involved, definitely the only female. And it got really contentious. That's the thing about money. Conversations involving a lot of money can create a lot of tension sometimes. But I knew what my guardrails were. I had talked to Sly enough about where he wanted this project to go, what he was comfortable with the deal looking like, and that sort of thing. So I just stuck to my guns. And at the end of the conversation or argument, depending on how you want to frame it, I'm walking out of the mayor's office with all the different stakeholders, all 10 of them. And one guy says, "Hey, you really were so bitchy in that meeting and you alienated everyone at the table. There's no way that you're going to get the mayor's agenda implemented." Another guy pulled me over to the other side of the room and said, "Why did you let everyone walk all over you? You're never going to get the mayor's agenda implemented." And I thought to myself, am I schizophrenic? What is happening here? But it was very apparent to me in that moment that if I was experiencing that dynamic, chances are plenty of other women in the workforce had experienced that dynamic. And I kind of thought to myself, and at that point I knew I was carrying a little girl around my belly. I kind of thought to myself, I'm going to do something about this one day. So, what does this all mean? This dynamic of the thin line between cupcake and bitch, about being too nice for some people, too bitchy for other people. I decided I was going to write a book. And when I put together the outline and sent the outline and the title to a couple of publishers, some of them refused to publish the book with the word bitch in the title. But I thought to myself, if that word in that context offends you, you're probably not going to get the point of the book anyway. So I stuck to my guns and found a publisher who was willing to publish a book with the word bitch in the title. And I wanted to give a blueprint, as I mentioned at the beginning of our time together, a blueprint for men and women to widen the thin line between cupcake and bitch. And my whole premise is that each of us have power inside of us that we can leverage to widen that thin line. And so, power is something that I talk a lot about in the book. And the key for power is preparation. And what I often tell young women when I speak to young women about how to navigate leadership positions is that for me, feeling like um, I didn't quite belong in these spaces. Definitely suffered from imposter syndrome. Still do. I don't feel like imposter syndrome is something that you're ever really rid of. It's something that you figure out how to deal with. Um, I always knew that I was going to be the most prepared person on the substance for any meeting or any negotiation, any conversation that I had to have. And the thing about knowing your stuff when you walk in a room is that you are better able to pivot and navigate some of those tricky gender bias issues that may come to you. Like when the Speaker of the House tells you to come sit in his lap so that you can have a conversation with him. I knew my stuff. I knew every pro and con to early voting. And that's just one example. Also, another example of preparation. I have 2 degrees in political communication. I am not a real estate development attorney. And in those conversations, like around the convention hotel, all of those gentlemen that I was in conversation with were real estate development attorneys. So I started out that whole adventure um, ordering law school books on Amazon and reading through all of them, taking all the lessons that a first year law school student would have taken, just so I was familiar with the words and the concepts they were using. I also made sure I had the subject matter experts very close to me, the finance director, our legal team, and that type of thing, and develop trust with them so that they knew that we were all playing on the same team, so that they would help me prepare for those types of conversations. Ownership. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the concept of executive presence. I love this concept. Um, so executive presence, there's 3 different presences. There is physical presence, how you physically show up in a room. And we often don't want to admit that how you physically show up in a room, it is the first thing people see. Like it or not, that is just a fact. And when you have strong physical presence, it can make people want to hear more about your perspective and what you have to say and what your opinion is and the vision that you want to take a group. Let me tell you an example of how I really screwed this up one time. So, you all may recall, spring of 2019, SLY had a ballot initiative that would have provided a universal pre K program. It spoiler alert, it did not pass. But it was something that he and I both felt very strongly about. You might recall me telling you that my mom, when she was 15 and had a newborn, was very committed to making sure that I could go to an early childhood development center so that I could have the tools to not live in that trailer park anymore. And Sly feels very strongly about early childhood too. And so this was a huge priority of ours. And it became part of the campaign for me to go and talk to a lot of women's groups about how early childhood education and access to childcare is actually a women's issue. And so I went to a church in Brookside after working a full day at City Hall, and we were going to have a town hall with working mothers about the pre K ballot initiative. And again, I had been working a full day at City Hall. It was a third day, so we had a city council meeting. So, which usually meant that I was in the middle of city council drama, and sometimes in front of TV cameras. So, of course, I was going to wear a business suit. I didn't take the time to think through where I was going when I left City Hall. So I went to this church basement to meet with working moms, many of which went home, changed, grabbed their kids, brought them with a baby bottle or with a snack. And when I walked in a business suit, my physical presence, whether I realized it or not, and I did not, my physical presence told these working moms that I was from the government and I was here to tell them what their problem was and how I was going to solve it. They were not interested in talking to me. They were not interested in hearing about the ballot initiative. They were just kind of sizing me up, thinking, what does this woman know about me, uh, working mom from 12th in Brooklyn with 3 babies hanging off of me? And I got to figure out how to get my 3 babies to childcare and take 2 bus lines. What does this woman know? So that's an example of how physical presence really can impact the rest of a conversation. Communication presence is the second type of presence. And 90% of communication is nonverbal, things like eye contact. If you want to instill confidence and develop trust with someone, make eye contact with them. There's a lot of psychological research that suggests that people who make direct eye contact with individuals or groups, that they develop more trust and they have stronger leadership skills. Emotional presence. This is the trickiest one, in my opinion. Emotional presence is self management, managing your own emotions. There were times throughout my career in government where I would be surrounded by elected officials who my grandma in the trailer park would accuse them of pitching a fit. And that is what it was. They did not exhibit strong emotional presence. They could not manage their own emotions. They would just pitch a fit to try and prove a point. And that's not really a way to bring people along, to see your side of something and to embrace your leadership vision. The W of power is wisdom. Wisdom is all about emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence is emotional presence, the concept we just talked about. It's that on steroids. And emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage the emotions of others. And this includes influencing people and building trust. And it's also the ability to use your emotions to effectively guide thinking and action. Wisdom. And then E in power is energy. When you're dealing with gender bias and racial discrimination for some individuals in our society, it's really important to find the energy to keep a forward trajectory, even in the face of sexism, racism, bigotry, negativity, any of that stuff, so that you can move forward and have the tools that you need to maintain your energy. When I was in the mayor's office, dealing with 30 potatoes, I prioritized running in our city's beautiful trails. Tried to run 4 or 5 days a week, and it wasn't so much for the physical nature of it. It was because it was like the only 45, 50 minutes a day that no one was talking to me. And when you're in that leadership position and you feel like your all of your decisions are under a microscope, it's kind of nice to have silence and to be alone with your thoughts. And that was one way, just an example that I tried to keep my energy level up. And then the R in power is respect. It's really important for individuals to respect themselves and know when it's time to disengage from an individual or a situation. And this can be a toxic family situation, it can be a toxic workforce dynamic, but knowing to respect yourself is really important. And when you overlay that with imposter syndrome, some of us, I know I'm guilty of this, are not always as good at respecting ourselves and our boundaries as we probably should be. So, I love talking to audiences about how they can use their own power to widen the thin line between cupcake and bitch, because I really do think every one of us has power inside of us. It's figuring out an authentic way to use that so that we widen the thin line between cupcake and bitch. And it's figuring out communication styles that we have. There are several different communication styles that are visible in society and in workplaces, and there isn't really one that's right and there isn't really one that's wrong. It's figuring out what's authentic to you and what's most strategic in a particular environment. I will tell you one thing that I have found very interesting over my career, and I'm sure many of you have found this too, is that oftentimes there are socially acceptable male communication styles, which means that the way that society views communication is typically from a male lens. And this comes from generations of women not being able to speak until they were spoken to first. So if you're in a business meeting, if you're in a church forum, or if you're in a neighborhood association meeting, you might see that men typically talk more loudly than women. They typically talk over women. And oftentimes, it's more commonly acceptable for men to be verbal processors. Verbal processors are people who kind of think while they talk. And it goes back to the socially male acceptable forms of communication styles, where, again, women weren't allowed to speak in spaces unless they were spoken to first. And so we're still kind of breaking down those gender biases and figuring out ways that we can amplify women's voices and communication styles. There's also different leadership styles. Communication is a step towards leadership. And one thing that I think COVID has really illuminated is how valuable empathy driven and servant leadership is. And those types of traits that are part of servant leadership tend to really align well with common female traits. So there's a study that just came out a couple of months ago in the Journal of Applied Psychology that said that bosses who were attentive to employees' emotional needs, some people may say motherly, bosses who were attentive to employees' emotional needs helped workers stay engaged during the pandemic. This is Professor Jasmine Hu at Ohio State University. She said she led a leadership study on teams, and she specializes in servant leadership. And she says that this empathy driven management style is uniquely suited to modern realities. And while servant leaders can be any gender, the style fits with female leaders' stereotypical characteristics of being nurturing, relationship oriented, and tending to emotional needs. So it's almost like COVID told us that women actually are natural leaders. When a space needs someone who is nurturing, someone who is empathetic, and good listeners. It's also important for us to all recognize that women aren't monolithic. There are different women who make up our community and our society as a whole. There are women who experience racism in a way that a middle class white woman who lives in the Northland does not. There are women with different physical abilities who has to navigate life and deal with communication styles and leadership styles in a different way. I have a colleague who it was in a terrible car wreck. She's in a wheelchair now, and she talks a lot about how she can create a sense of authority when she can't stand up and be eye to eye with someone. It's really interesting to think about. Um, Gender bias, it is often at the root of women being underestimated. I'll go back to the story that I started with this morning. Senator Edwards, again, lots of character flaws, but a nice $400 haircut. But he really was right when he said that um, as a petite Southern woman with a Southern accent, there definitely have been many moments throughout my career that I've been underestimated, and I'm sure you all can identify with that as well. But it's important to figure out if we're not sensing a feeling of belonging outwardly, how we can create that sense of self within ourselves. And I do think that finding the power within ourselves, whether you identify as male, female, it, we all have a role to play in power to leverage in widening the thin line between cupcake and bitch. And he was also right about the fact that knowing that sometimes we can be underestimated, we can just be bitter about it and be mad about it. But I've always believed that being mad about something is just a start. That in order to finish that emotion, we have to use power to change the dynamics that we're actually mad at. And for me, that involved writing this book, The Thin Line Between Cupcake and Bitch, and uh, making sure that um, I was done talking anyway. So, making sure that everyone understands that they all have power that they can leverage to widen that line. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. That's Joni Wickham, and the former mayoral chief of staff and the partner of Wickham and James. And I'm glad to be here at a forum that can embrace and take the challenge of the word bitch. And so now, before we get to the question and answer portion of this, we're going to take a moment to take up a collection to support the work of the Forum at All Souls. And you can also give online at allsoulskc.org by clicking on the blue button on the main page. I also want to tell you about next week's forum right here. Chuck Downing is going to help us all rethink our lawns with the attention to the health and the environment and our impact on future generations. So the question part is, speaking to this microphone over here on the left, one question per person till everyone's had a chance. And for those of you who are online, you can type questions into the chat, and we will be monitoring those, and then we will try to get to those as we can also. And all right, Joni, back to you.
Are you going to ask me if I'm a cupcake or bitch today?
Could you talk a little bit about the power of listening and being a good listener? And the reason I ask that is because it seems to me that in any meeting situation, there are people who are so intent on getting their point of view across that they're not really listening to what anybody else is saying. So could you comment on that whole situation?
Yes, that's such a good question. Active listening is a concept that I write about in my book. And active listening means that you are listening to someone's thoughts to hear perhaps what they're not telling you, but maybe what their facial expressions are telling you. It means that you are listening to someone in order to understand their frame of reference and their perspective. It's the opposite of listening to someone in order to come up with what your response is. This is really an important leadership component. I used to always joke with Sly and tell him that he had to retrain his ears because he's a very accomplished trial attorney. And attorneys, I read a article one time that said that attorneys and journalists tend to listen in order to form their opinions so that they can create a response to what's being said. Because if you think about what attorneys and journalists do, that's kind of part of their gig, right? But in leadership, particularly if you have to solve problems, that's not always the best way to listen. Active listening is very important. I think it's in short supply. And my unpopular opinion is that I think social media is making our active listening skills worse. That's the topic of another book.
Thank you very much. My first takeaway is that I'm not going to use the term bitch anymore. And what I gained from it was that a bitch is a female that a man thinks doesn't agree with him or he doesn't get what he wants from. Could you, and the others, if my recollection is correct, bitch is actually a female canine. I think it's the Could you just describe the origin of that? Because it's ironic because in the canine world, the female is the alpha.
Mhm.
So, in the course of your work here, did you actually come up with where this nasty term came from?
So, thank you for phrasing it that way. So, the whole thesis of my book is that we have to widen the thin line between cupcake and bitch, not castigate someone for being a bitch, not running over them because they're a cupcake. But my thought is sometimes it's perfectly appropriate to be a cupcake. Sometimes when tensions are very high, what's needed is a cupcake, someone to come in with empathy and active listening skills to get something done. There are other times that what's needed in a room is a bitch. And it's perfectly acceptable. It's being a strategic bitch that's important.
Good morning, Joni.
Hi.
Thank you for today. I'm wondering how you feel about that women are still being policed in communication, such as in Slack channels and whatnot, being brought up on toning, or I call toning their communication styles, such as could you please add emoticons to your responses, especially back to men, but men aren't policed in that type of toning, such as, please get this done by 6. Or like a man can do that, but women are being asked, can you add some emojis to that? Like, please get this done by 6. Can you talk about that in the communication style? That's still happening
Mhm.
to women in the workspace when it used to be asynchronous communications and email. That's still now happening, such as in Slack and other of type of communications.
Yeah, the reason I wanted to write a book that appealed and educated men and women is because I don't think it is solely a woman's role to change gender bias and those types of policing issues that you see. So I would encourage men to be brave and stand up when they see those types of policing happening. Just a real quick story on that topic. When I was about 8 months pregnant, we had a economic development symposium downtown, and I mean waddled because I was 8 months pregnant, waddled into this symposium that I had worked on for 6 weeks. I had brought all the journalists to the table. I had already briefed all the stakeholders. There were probably 30 people there. And so this was kind of, pun intended, my baby. So I walk in this thing with Sly that I had been working on for 6 weeks. And um, they had this room downtown set up in like a horseshoe shape. I'm sure you've seen those with chairs around them. And everyone who was involved in the symposium had a placard with their name on it. And when Sly and I walked in, I immediately saw that no one had thought to leave a space for me at the table. Literally, I did not have a seat at the table that I had built. And when Sly noticed this, he threw a strategic spectacle. He pitched a fit, as my grandma would say, because no one at that table, again, because it's economic development and that's a very white male centered sector, no one in that environment had thought to include me at the table that I had worked so hard to build. So he walked over to the side, picked up a chair, sat the chair right beside him, not on the side, not in the back, right beside him, wrote my name on it in big block letters and sat it right beside him. And that showed all the men in that space where he thought I belonged. And none of them ever treated me the same after that. So it's really important for men to use their power, their voice, and their privilege as well.
I'm going to buy copies of your book for all my granddaughters.
Oh, cool.
Uh,
Thank you.
can I get a quantity discount? There are a lot.
Yes. Yes, my publisher is great about that. He's great about using the word bitch and he's great about discounts.
But my question is, how do you navigate these Zoom hybrid meetings where you can't really see the other person's facial, you can't see their body language? How do you navigate that?
So I advise people, particularly women, because we are still overcoming gender bias, as we've talked about today, that your emotions have to almost feel like you're overcompensating for something. Your gestures and your facial expressions have to almost feel inwardly fake to you in order to come across in a real strategic and impactful manner on Zoom. It's very difficult. There's a lot of research out there that's just being published about how this hybrid world and virtual world has negatively impact perceptions of women leaders for that very reason.
I too am going to buy a bunch of your books for two daughters and 5 granddaughters. Anyway, how do you you mentioned the term executive presence,
Mhm.
and that you didn't seem to elaborate on exactly that. But my thought is, how do you listen to others during such a meeting, and then try to complement and kind of incorporate all those opinions into the final thing without being taking control and just saying, well, there's a wisdom in this, or how do you go about
kind of incorporating all those ideas?
I think the underlying foundation of executive presence and being able to do all those three executive presence as well is active listening. Because um, you can't double down on the emotional presence, managing your own emotions and being cognizant of your physical presence and paying attention to everyone's nonverbal cues if you're not deeply engaging in active listening. So I think that's very important. I also think it's something that you get better with over time. I do workshops on executive presence sometimes, and I tell people to think of executive presence as a muscle that you build and it gets stronger over time. I don't think you are born with all the executive presence you're ever gonna have. It's something that you can hone over time.
I want to take the prerogative to ask a question here. The I want to just ask you a little bit about another line that we're walking along, and in your presentation today in your book, you don't name that speaker. Is it R.J.?
I don't name the
Yeah, the
uh,
Speaker of the House.
it is not.
Yeah, right.
It's a different one.
So, but that speaker and many other politicians in the Missouri House came under fire, and a lot of them got what was coming to them finally. And there was started a big investigation, and that culture you talked about was more prevalent than many people would have imagined. Maybe they could have imagined it. My question is, you're also in this line where you what you do to get along and still do the business, or what point do you actually call something out to try to get that kind of retribution that's needed?
Yeah, that's the R of power, respect. Knowing when to respect yourself, and when you don't have to tolerate, bad behavior. Um, I think that is an easier dynamic to navigate when you're older in your career. When I was 23 and that was happening to me, I didn't say a damn thing. I sat there and shut up. I would not do that today as a 42-year-old, more confident woman. And so I think that's another place where we all have to find the power within ourselves. For those of us who are maybe more seasoned leaders who are in a different place in our career, when we see those types of behaviors, to call it out and make sure people know that it's not acceptable.
I want to ask another question. Uh, so now one thing you talked about the early childhood,
Mhm.
and there I think there's a dynamic there also that the mayor's term was his time was coming to an end. I mean, how that might have benefited. I mean, because it's still an issue. The governor is trying to get early childhood funding in the state,
It's
and
even worse now than it was in 2019 when we were
yeah,
doing it. I tell Sly all the time that sometimes you're ahead of your time, and I think we were on that issue.
yeah. So I mean, would there have been another way to go where you don't push for the election at that time, but somehow support one outside of his term? It is that's what when you have if you thought that through.
That is one issue that I feel like if you are not, I'm going to be a policy wonk for a second. If you are not a family trying to navigate finding childcare and then trying to figure out once you find a seat in a childcare environment, how you afford it. My daughter is now 10 years old. When she was in our early childhood center, it was $13,500 a year. So unless you are a family trying to find a spot and figure out how to pay for a spot, in my experience with that 2019 ballot initiative, you really didn't get it. And so I don't feel like we had enough time to really organize the people most directly impacted by that issue. And I think that if there were an effort to do that today, it would be a little easier because COVID showed everybody that you might not have a little one that you're trying to place in a childcare center, or that you have to figure out how to come up with, I think it's $15,000 a year now. But if your employees can't come to work, that is a real issue for you. If they can't come to work because they have a 3-year-old who's hanging off them in the Zooms, it's a real issue. And so I just think it really heightened to me that when you are trying to push a public policy issue, you have to be very deliberate about engaging and organizing the people who are most impacted by that issue. And I don't think because of the dynamic you said, We ran 18 elections in 8 years and won 16 of them. Ugh. And we just, when you're doing that much stuff and just the day to day of running a city with 500,000 people, we just ran out of time to really organize the people most directly impacted by it.
You describe what I would consider a corporate thinking that with a history of a large corporation, there's always a factor of personalities that are disingenuous.
Mhm.
And so how do you deal with that without trying to rub their nose in it?
Yeah, there are no disingenuous personalities in politics. None. Just $400 haircuts. Um, how do you This is also a concept that is easier for me to understand and actualize now than it was earlier, but I think it's important to meet people where they are. When I was hot-headed and 22 and thought I knew the answer to everything, I didn't really see that as valuable as I do now. Um, but I can completely see after working in the US Senate, state capitol, local government, and now in my consulting gig, how important it is to meet people where they are, even if you don't agree with them on a policy issue or on a personal issue or whatever it is. It is easier to move people towards a common vision when you meet them where they are and help change their perspective and give them the tools that they need to get where you need them to be. Easier said than done and takes a lot of emotional intelligence.
Hey, and I guess a closing thought, if you could. I mean, you made this book with the purpose that you had, and you probably gotten some reactions to it. Are there any particular moments that you thought it was worth? Because it takes a lot of work to do a book. So when are there times when you thought, okay, yeah, this is the right thing. It's been good.
Yeah, every time I hear a guy who read this book, and they say, "I'm so glad I read your book because I didn't realize X. I didn't realize Y." That means so much to me because, again, meeting people where they are and giving them a different perspective and the tools that they need to be more empathetic, to engage more in active listening, to consider how executive presence can shift a leadership perception. That's really cool to me because um, I want men to see the power that they have to shift gender bias. So I really have appreciated those stories from the guys who read the book.
All right. Well, thank you very
Thank
much, Joni
thank you for
Wickham, for
thank you
being
for
on the
having me.
forum here today. And everyone's welcome. The service begins at 10:45. Stay for that. And also next Sunday will be Chuck Downing talking on rethinking your lawn. So again, thank you, Joni. Thank you. You got to go, right? Thank you so much for all this. That was an extremely wide range of what happened with it. It was just really some of it kind of doing around. Thank you so much. It's a novel, but it's like, yeah. And then any given to this